Khalifa Haftar is a man with many titles, an army chief under Muammar Gaddafi, who then spent 2 decades in exile in the United States before returning home to join the uprising against Gaddafi, and eventually becoming the commander of the self-proclaimed Libyan National Army. General Haftar and his army supports the parliament in the country's east. He does not recognise the UN-backed government of national accord led by Prime Minister Fayez Sarraj in the west. And that places Haftar at the centre of the divided nation. He commands loyalty from his troops and the people in the east for his ongoing fight against Daesh and other militant groups.
This enemy, Daesh, is not just Libya's enemy alone. It is spreading everywhere. Their only goal is killing, slaughtering, and destruction. It has no other mission but the devastation of land.
That perspective has attracted him backing from Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Russia.
As is happening currently in Libya, where bets are first made on Sarraj, then on Haftar, we want them to sit down and come to an agreement.
France's new government has also signalled its support for the commander, saying Libya needs to build a national army under civilian control with the participation of all the forces that fight terrorism across the country, including those of General Haftar. Haftar did meet with the GNA's Prime Minister Sarraj in Abu Dhabi in early May. Both promised to fight terrorism but didn't commit to a shared solution to Libya's political stalemate. Weeks on, it appears that the only clear outcome is that Haftar remains the man most likely to hold the title of Libya's military strongman. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Benghazi is Faraj Najm. He's a Libyan historian and author of Tribes, Islam and State in Libya. And from San Antonio, Mansour Al-Kikhia. He's a professor of political science at University of Texas at San Antonio. Thanks both of you for joining us, gentlemen. Faraj, is Haftar becoming the next Gaddafi here? That's what a lot of people think.
Well, it depends on where you are in the political landscape. I mean, if you are opposing what Haftar and the National Libyan Army is doing, obviously you would call him Gaddafi. But if you were where I am, seeing that the man is salvaging the nation from those savages and terrorists, then obviously you wouldn't. So it depends on where you are. Okay,
so Faraj, why doesn't he take the role of head of army that the foreign minister offered him? Why doesn't he come together with the government, the UN-backed government of national accord, and work with them to defeat terrorists, as you put it?
Well, as you rightly said, it's a UN-backed government, but it isn't a Libyan-backed government. The government, the so-called GN, the General Accord government, has not been embedded in the Libyan constitution. It has not been accepted by the Libyan parliament, and it has a PR problem amongst Libyans. So they need to do something in order to legitimize themselves, and then they can deal with the legitimate head of army who has been appointed by the parliament, by the democratically elected parliament, to fight those terrorists.
Okay, so Mansour, this is bad PR and this is a smear campaign from those who are calling Haftar the next Gaddafi. He's actually saving his country, according to Faraj. What do you think?
Well, you can't deny Haftar's role in saving at least Cyrenaica from terrorism, and I have no doubt that sometime in the future they might even put up a statue for him. This is one. But the problem is, I think Libya is still under the influence too much of the Gaddafi era, and you still have sycophants who constantly deify him in ways that they shouldn't be doing that. I don't think it's really Haftar's problem. I think he's enjoying it. The other factor which you asked him a very legitimate question. Why does he join the government of national accord? And I would like to say it's not really a government of national accord. It's a government of national discord, because he's as your guest quite rightly said, it's an illegitimate government. And I wrote a letter to them, in fact, to the Prime Minister and Mr. Sarraj, and I told him, you don't get legitimacy from the United Nations, you get it from the Libyans. And you have, when you do that, you really have no respect for the Libyans by doing this. It's shameful for you to be actually saying what you're saying and not abiding by at least by respecting Libyans in a way.
Okay, so Mansour,
Haftar,
sure.
I don't.
Sure, please continue. Finish your point, and then I'll ask you.
I mean, Haftar, I think he can be blamed for many things, but ultimately, I think he's human as well too, and then he's enamored with power, and this is the first opportunity that he really gets power. I think it might get to his head, and this is my major fear. But I see Libya, and I've been there for a couple of times in the last 3 months. And I see it, and I see this deifying of Haftar, and it scares me. It really does scare me, because I'm afraid of the return of the military rule and of Gaddafi's rule.
Right. Okay, so Faraj, let's then take what you said and pose it to Faraj. You guys are making a massive big deal of this man. You're creating the cult of the strongman, the image of the strongman. You're not criticizing him. And Mansour sees all the warning signs that he saw in the country beforehand with Gaddafi. Doesn't he make a good point?
He does, actually. There are people who long for Gaddafi's era, those who still green, as we say in Libya, the supporters of the old regime, and they see Haftar symbolizing Gaddafi and Gaddafi's strong rule in Libya. But let me just tell you something, because I come from a city which toppled Gaddafi and supported Haftar recently, and can again, if Haftar steps out of the line, then the city, I'm sure, and the region that I come from, Cyrenaica, will put an end to this. This is not about dictatorship. This is not about misrule. It's about fight against terrorism. And here we have a fight for survival. It's either us or either them.
Right, but the two sides
cannot be
the two sides definitely disagree on who are the terrorists. That's the point. Sure, that they disagree on who are the terrorists, which is why I'm going to ask you, because of that disagreement and because of the fact that there are two camps here, aren't we going to see Tobruk versus Tripoli, a massive civil war, and Libyans lose? Libyans are the ones that suffer, while the two camps believe that they are in a righteous war. That's what's going to happen, isn't it?
No, this is a full characterization of the situation in Libya. And here we have a nation that went into election, and they elected a parliament freely and fairly, and the parliament had to go to Benghazi. They couldn't, so they had to be located to Tobruk. And on the other hand, we have gangs and thugs of Islamists who are ruling the Tripoli, who are refusing to adhere to the ballot box, and instead they used bullets. And this is the problem here.
So you believe, sir, that the United Nations backs Islamist thugs?
No. The United Nations is stuck between a rock and a hard place. They're trying to redeem Tripoli, where the state institutions are centralized, and they try to impose what they call a general national accord government, which has not been accepted by the Libyans. And also they wanted to embed the Islamists into the process. Now the Libyans, the public by and large, and I am one of them, do reject the Islamists, especially when they rejected them in the election, but also they reject the new style of government, which is the use of terrorism by way of ruling the government or ruling the country. And this is problematic with us.
Okay. Mansour, is it a very simple equation for the likes of the United Arab Emirates and the Egyptians and Russia and France to a certain extent as well, according to some reports, that they back Haftar because he's not a political Islamist? They back him because he's not on that side of political Islamism, no more, no less.
Well, let me tell you, Imran, the issue over here, each of these countries has its own interest in this game. And Egypt has its different interests, which I think is quite different from that of the Emirates. But on the whole, you might be quite right in what you're saying. But I'd like to go much further. I'm also from the east. I'm also from Benghazi, and I think Haftar is not being very smart in much of what he's doing right now. He's trying to enter Tripoli, and your other guest is quite right. The idea that Tripoli is and will continue to be dominated and controlled by militias and by Islamists, and this is really intrinsic within the system itself. You have to understand there's a huge difference between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. In Cyrenaica, there's always emerged a sense of unity. This is basically due to the religious nature of Cyrenaicans under the Senussia movement, created a sense of unity among Cyrenaicans. And the Senussia movement in itself, as a religious movement, which was quite mild, prevented radical thought from entering Libya. Until Gaddafi came. When Gaddafi destroyed the Tunisia movement, he had opened the floodgates for huge radical movements coming from the Wahhabis, from the Muslim Brotherhood, and the problem, they stuck much more within the West than the East, and now we see it in the West, which is a very dangerous state of affairs, which I think Haftar is by going there and trying to occupy the West, he's going to be in deep trouble. Okay. Because in the West you have just give me 1 second. Sure, I'm sorry, sure. Imran. 1 second. In the West you have it's not tribe against tribe, but region against region. Misrata hates Tripoli. Tripoli hates Beni Walid. Beni Walid hates Burjvana. And the hatred is so much that they're willing to destroy each other. In the East, you don't have that.
Right. Okay.
Why would Haftar be going to the West to do this?
Great point. So, Faraj, like Napoleon going east, maybe Haftar going west is a bad idea. What if he takes Tripoli? What if he takes Tripoli and nobody recognizes him and nobody wants him to take Tripoli? Aren't you going to have a really ugly situation, Faraj?
Exactly.
Well, I hope he doesn't go to Tripoli at all. I totally agree with Professor Mansour al-Kikhia. There is a huge difference between Cyrenaica and Tripolitania. Cyrenaica is much more homogeneous than Tripolitania. And I, as a Cyrenaican, I don't like the idea of him taking our boys and going to Tripolitania. But the man, he's developing a different strategy. We've seen that recently in Fazan. He wants to go there by the local boys. Look at Fazan. Fazan has been liberated by its own people. And that's what he's trying to do in Tripolitania by entering Tripoli, using Tripolitanians who are willing to pay the price, like the way that we did in the East, especially in Benghazi, in order to redeem themselves from this cancerous groups.
Right. Mansour, let's broaden it out just before we end this discussion and look at the international community, the likes of NATO, the Egyptians and so on. They've been conducting airstrikes. They've also been killing scores of civilians by those airstrikes that are targeting Daesh and so on. As things stand, in late May 2017, is the international community doing more harm or more good in Libya?
I think the international community is doing more harm than good on the one hand, because, as I said, and you brought up a point that the United Nations supports terrorists and thugs, and your guest said no. I say yes, they are. I think it's shameful for what the United Nations is doing, for what the United States and Britain and France, by supporting an illegitimate government at the expense of legitimacy which Libyans deserve to have. They lecture us 24 hours a day about democracy, and yet they're the first not to support democracy. They're imposing a government that is quite effete, that's not able to control the country, that is part of the problem. They're supporting it to dominate the country. Which is, I think, is wrong. Is it going to get better? No, I don't think it's going to get better. And therefore, my advice to Mr. Haftar is very simple. Listen, I'm a federalist, and if federalism does not work, I'm a separatist. And I say, save what you can of Libya, of what present Libya, because you can't save the West. There's no way of saving it. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's quite depressing.
And ultimately, I say, It is, yes, it is depressing, unfortunately. But you know, your guest is quite right. You know, the people who've been fighting in this thing have been those from the east. They're the people who've been dying. Benghazi lost 8,000 people to terrorists. 8,000. The city is destroyed due to terrorists. And the West is responsible largely for doing that.
Okay.
So how do you want us to act?
Okay, gentlemen, appreciate your passion and your
Yes,
knowledge. It's been great talking to both of you. Unfortunately, I've got to wrap. But thanks so much for joining us, Faraj and Mansour.